All right, welcome to another episode of Around the County with Supervisor Jim Desmond. I'm Miles Himmel, Communications Director for District 5. And we've got a special guest here today. We got Jacob Mchangama, got a new book out called Free Speech, A History of Socrates to Social Media. Jacob, thank you for being here. And if you don't mind, just when we start, if you don't tell people your credentials, who you are, what you do.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on and reaching out to me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so I actually am a Danish lawyer by training and profession. I run a think tank called Justitia, which focuses on human rights issues. And I also run our project on the future of free speech, which tries to sort of, think around issues related to free speech and tries to counter what I label the free speech recession, where all around the globe free speech seems to be in retreat. Even the idea of free speech in open democracies that actually depend on free speech for their as one of their basic values and to protect their broader values. So that's very shortly what I do and who I am.
Well, why? You go.
You sure? Okay. Well, I read your op-ed. I guess it was in the Wall Street Journal recently. Is that true? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I mean, particularly when we hear tech giants are canceling people, or if they're upsetting them, or they don't, if they reach a certain bar that has been set by these social media giants, and then basically silencing people. It's kind of scary. I mean, no matter what side you're on the issues, and then even the hate speech that the EU, as you wrote about, is clamping down on state and hate speech. And one nation, you got Brussels is going to be making the determination of what's hate speech for 27 countries. I think that was pretty phenomenal. I thought, to have all that power.
Yeah, the equivalent of that would be sort of to have in the U.S. sort of Congress adopt a federal hate speech law. You imagine the disagreement that would be in this country about who gets to define and enforce what constitutes hate speech, and at such a time in American history where polarization is rampant. I think you would see very, very different definitions of hate speech in say California and Florida, maybe, and many other states. And it would basically, I think there would be a temptation on the part of many politicians to use laws against hate speech sort of as a weapon to sort of browbeat their opponents and to protect themselves from criticism. And of course, that's also what I fear will happen at the European level, where we already have very stringent hate speech laws in many countries, including Germany and France, where people are being punished for speech that you in this country would think of as completely protected. But then you rightly mentioned that the First Amendment only protects against official censorship on the part of the government, whether federal, state, or local governments. But then you have Facebook or your YouTube that has billions of users and then decides the limits of free speech on those platforms, and they have a First Amendment right to do so. But on the other hand, it's also clear that where they draw that line impacts the practical exercise of free speech in all countries around the world. And so the idea that this has nothing to do with the free speech, as some claim, I think is a bit far-fetched, because one of the promises of the internet early on was it would allow ordinary citizens a voice. Previously it would be politicians, editors, journalists that have a privileged access to the public sphere as institutional gatekeepers. The promise of the internet was to give the ordinary citizen a voice. And if that is then being limited based on some completely untransparent and opaque terms decided in Silicon Valley, then that impacts free speech as well.
Miles, did you have something earlier?
Yeah, well, I was just going to kind of an overview, but you kind of answered it there, Jacob. Is simple question. I think we all think, well, there's a reason we need free speech, but why do we need the free speech? Why is hate speech allowed? Can you kind of give us I know your book is a history really on
Yeah.
free speech, so tell us why is it important?
Yeah, I think free speech is, it comes back goes all the way back to the Athenian democracy some 2,500 years ago. And there's a reason, it's not a coincidence that democracy and free speech go hand in hand. So it's this egalitarian idea that everyone who's affected by the laws and decisions made in their name should have a right to have a say in that. And you also see that very strongly in the thoughts of James Madison, the architect of what would become the First Amendment, so that popular sovereignty depends on those in who the people in whose names laws are being made should have a direct say on what those laws should be about, how they're being administered, and should have a right to criticize those who exercise power in their name. So that's a very important reason for it. But more than that, or in addition to that, it's also that there's a great meme written by the Cato's letters, which became sort of the most influential writings for the founding generation in many ways. And that's that free speech constitutes the great bulwark of liberty. So in other words, if you don't have free speech, then all your other liberties and freedoms are in danger, because it's only by criticizing overreach on the part of the government or corruption or encroaching tyranny that you have sort of a way to warn and shed a light on those things. And so if you don't have free speech, you won't have any other freedoms. And of course, you could also think of it in terms of scientific progress. It's inherent in scientific progress that you have a right to, you propose a thesis and others can rigorously test it. If you don't have that scientific freedom, if there's strict religious limits on what science can look at, then you're not going to have the same progress that has been, mind-blowing in our part of the world for a long time, and that has been an instrumental part in the progress and wealth that has been created in Western democracy. Of course, religion, religious tolerance, religious diversity also depends on the ability of people to practice their faith, read whatever religious books they want, say prayers that contain the religious content that conforms to their understanding of whatever faith, and not some centralized top-down orthodoxy defining the permissible limits of faith. So those are some of the, I think, most important elements of why free speech is important. Then, there'll be lots of people who say, yes, we all agree with that, but hate speech, for instance, we should limit that because speech can lead to harms, or they may even say that you can't distinguish between acts and speech. And I think it's right that speech does come with costs and harms, but I think that history shows that the fact that speech can lead to certain harms does not necessarily mean that censorship or restrictions on free speech will A, be an efficient remedy, or B, will not be a cure that's worse than the disease. And I try to show, for instance, that the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazi Party in Germany, the Nazis were often censored, and they used it to sort of as a platform for martyrdom, and it was not efficient in keeping down Nazi ideology. Another part of American history is how in the antebellum South, laws in the 1830s, laws were passed that strictly prohibited the idea of abolitionist ideas. So you could not argue that white slave owners did not have a right to property in their black slaves. That was seen as a crime, and in fact, we have examples from Alabama where someone was charged because he argued that it was against. It was against the Bible. Slavery ran against the Bible, and there was a grand jury indictment against him for speaking his mind on that. And essentially, I think those who worry that free speech can be used to entrench unequal power positions or hurt minorities have got it the other way around. Traditionally or historically, free speech has been one of the most powerful engines of human equality and really instrumental for previously persecuted minorities and groups. Right here, I'm in Washington, D.C., very close to Lafayette Square outside the White House. And if you go back to 1917, you had a number of suffragettes, so women's rights activists who were I think they were burned in an effigy of President Woodrow Wilson at the time because they were fighting for the right to vote. For universal suffrage, and they were arrested. And I remember living in New York in 2018, and I took my son to a museum, and then when I went out of the museum, the streets were filled with tens of thousands of protesters, most of them women, who were wearing these hats, and I won't say what kind of hats, because this is polite company. But the NYPD, as opposed to 100 years previously, were protecting their First Amendment rights to call the President of the United States, Donald Trump at the time, all kinds of unsavory things and protest vigorously against him. So that shows how free speech has also been absolutely instrumental for the rights of women. Unfortunately, I think we tend to forget those historical achievements that free speech has contributed to, and we take it for granted in many democracies and think, whenever there's something we don't like, we can just take a slice and it won't hurt us. But I think there's a great danger that it will actually come back to bite us in the end.
Wow, it's quite a analogy there, or the analogies you offered there. So it's very kind of compelling. It's you're damned if you do, damned if you don't in some cases. And one of the things we've struggled with here in San Diego County was one of our largest, most raucous meetings was on misinformation, and saying that we're not going to allow misinformation. It was primarily on COVID. And my struggle with that is, who defines what misinformation is? Because yesterday's facts are tomorrow's misinformation, just as we evolved with the virus. And then with hate speech, it's who defines hate speech. And it was really kind of interesting in your argument. You just brought it up again, to where the more we try to suppress it, the consequences are worse that come out of that suppression as opposed to what they were trying to suppress in the first place. It's sort of like, I remember as a teenager, my parents would tell me not to do something, and the first thing I did was go out and did it, and so it made things worse. So how do we kind of manage or what do we do with this as far as defining what is hate speech and what is not, and how do we get to, every person's opinion is a bit different on that. So what's your, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I don't think we should define it, legally. I think the First Amendment is a better way to manage it than, say, the European approach, which is to try and legally define it and then ban it. That does not mean that we should be indifferent to hatred. And it doesn't mean that we should be indifferent to misinformation. It just means that when we try to ban it, there's a very big danger of scope creep, so that all kinds of ideas and language that some group or other group finds problematic or is against could end up being defined as constituting hate speech. So, for instance, if you're part of the LGBT plus community, you might think that certain ideas about traditional forms of marriage that could potentially be hateful against you if someone advocates that. But then that that could then violate the rights of those who are religiously conservative and who think that traditional forms of marriage is an inherent part of their faith, and the other way around, if you like. And then who should get to decide? I think the Solomonic solution is here, that we can actually live together in peace and be, neighbors, colleagues, spouses, and countrymen, even though we disagree vociferously about many things. That is the genius of democracy. There was a time in Europe when we were killing each other over what today we think of as bizarre theological differences that very few people care about today. But we've showed that religious tolerance and free speech, we can manage that the same way. There are countries where political differences will put you in jail or worse, but you're part of a political system that thrives on differences of opinion. And of course, sometimes differences of opinion will get heated. Sometimes it's not very nice. We as social animals are drawn often to conformity, and it's never nice to be sort of in the minority and being told that you're that you're wrong. But I think the benefits of having a system built on free and open debate, free and equal speech, greatly outweighs all of the alternatives. And of course, when it comes specifically to misinformation, that is one of the oldest categories. It used to be heresy, in religious times, that if you held the wrong religious belief, you could be punished for that. But rulers, all authoritarian rulers, whether religious or secular, have tried to ban specific categories of speech that they claimed were against the truth as they defined it, and that is ultimately dangerous. And also, we have research. So the Royal Society, which is Britain's leading academic institution, actually went out and warned against purging and deleting scientific misinformation, saying that this would not only be ineffectual, but could also be a counterproductive way to fight misinformation on COVID and the like. And we have all these powerful tools that can actually help. If we don't, why believe in free speech if you don't believe that you can actually counter someone's ideas with other ideas? And I know you're in this country. You're at a moment in time where all kinds of issues related to identity and race and so on are being vigorously debated. And it's important to debate your history and all these things. But I think when you look at it, there's also signs of progress. So acceptance of interracial marriage, for instance, was 4% in 1958. Today it's 94%. And that to me is a huge example of social change. So I'm in DC again. So if I went across the river to Virginia in 1967, interracial marriage was prohibited. The Supreme Court had to step in and secure it. And those changes in attitudes were not achieved by censoring and putting people with bigoted attitudes in jail. It was to a very significant degree, I think, in fact, achieved through the exercise of First Amendment freedoms. So, documenting the great inequalities when it came to race, the unjustness of Jim Crow laws, and just appealing to the sense of common humanity. And I think those ultimately are stronger weapons than trying to ban or censor people with ideas that you don't like.
Wow, that's very compelling. I mean, you're right. I liked your term. We thrive on our differences of opinion, and as opposed to trying to bury each other with our difference of.
Exactly. It's free speech is ultimately the antithesis of violence. I think you can have a political institution where you disagree fundamentally about very first principles, but you respect each other's right to do so. And rather than settling them through going to war or coming to blows, you compromise. And the only way to compromise is for each side to air their opinions and their differences, and then you can find some kind of middle ground, and that's what democracies are good at. And it doesn't always leave all voters satisfied, but I think the alternative to sort of the stronger side winning through use of force is much better, and free speech is very much part and parcel of that.
Wow. Hey, Miles, I think I found a new speechwriter.
Yeah, I agree. Gosh,
Yeah.
Jacob.
Yeah. And so in your book, are you getting much traction with your book and your ideas? Are even your ideas being silenced or suppressed? I don't know. Are you making progress with your thoughts? Because I agree 100% that, it's into free speech. And I kind of cringe like when I hear, like I mentioned earlier, the tech giants quieting people down. That's scary to me. And when you talked about science and different things, Galileo, was thrown in jail by the Pope, but for exercising science and having a difference of opinion, and so that's an extreme I guess example, but it does seem that we're with all the differences in the silencing, it's getting a little scary out there. And even what I notice in certain areas of California here is that only certain labor groups get the jobs for like the big construction jobs and things like that. And to me, it is really kind of, it's a step beyond free speech. It's now only if you belong to this certain club or this certain membership, you get to work on projects and others don't. And it's kind of a scary phenomenon happening here well, even at the federal government and the federal level. The President Biden just, recognize that unions only get, for these larger contracts. And to me, that's a step beyond free speech. And now you're excluding people from actually jobs. And that's a scary path, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think sort of at a broader level, I think that one of the most important ideas that I try to get across in the book is that ultimately, I think free speech depends on a culture of tolerance rather than law. So, the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. The wording hasn't changed, but throughout its existence, people have been thrown in jail for criticizing President John Adams. They've been thrown in jail for advocating against involvement in World War I. They've been censored or punished for advocating, against slavery, against Jim Crow, and all these things. And today, it provides the strongest legal protection of any country in the world, which I think is a great achievement. But if the culture of free speech changes, if the ordinary American's commitment to free speech diminishes, then I think ultimately, you might end up in a situation one day where you have a majority of Supreme Court justices who will roll back the protections that have been built up over previous decades, and then suddenly the First Amendment will mean something very different. And that's why ultimately, those of us who have benefited from free speech are its ultimate guardians. If we want free speech as individuals and communities, then the likelihood is that we will get free speech if we also respect it and live up to its underlying ideals. But if we demand more, censorship of our co-citizens with whom we disagree, then the likelihood is that ultimately this will end up being the case. But then that might very well one day turn around, and we will be the targets rather than the beneficiaries of laws that restrict free speech.
Yeah. Well, Miles, you want to kind of wrap us up here?
Yeah. I had one more question, and then I'll wrap it up here, Justin. I know, we're obviously focused here on the United States and the free speech here, but I don't think some people may not realize how free speech is a very American thing, and how, I know you talked about Brussels and the EU, but England as well, and I'm not super familiar with it, but like, there can be, if you get attacked on social media and you get offended, you can go to the authorities with some of this thing. So even to us here in America, we'd go, that's crazy. You can go. Can you touch on that, like the differences between Europe and America when it comes to that?
Yeah. So let me give you a good example. So last year, France's President Emmanuel Macron, some guy at an anti-COVID lockdown demonstration had sort of depicted him as Hitler on these billboards, and he was fined something like $11,000. The guy who did it. Can you imagine how many people in the U.S. would have had to be punished if they had, if Donald Trump had sued everyone who likened him to Hitler or some kind of totalitarian leader, so that sort of, core political speech, regardless of who's the president, I think, hyperbole and that is related to politics is something that, the highest, the most powerful political leader in a country has to live with. That's simply part of the job, and it's dangerous if you give the president of a country the means to sort of silence criticism, even if it's hyperbolic and even if it's exaggerated and so on. And then of course, as I mentioned, we have hate speech laws. So everything from Holocaust denial can send you to jail in a number of European countries, but also sort of a broadening of the scope of hate speech laws to protect ever more categories, which leads to sort of a race to the gutter, if you like, and a competition among various groups to be a protected category with which you can then try to have your ideological or political opponents clubbed with laws.
Yeah.
Jacob, I appreciate you coming on, man. This has been really fascinating. So the new book is Free Speech, A History of Socrates to Social Media. If people want to know more, obviously they should go get the book. What else? How can they get in touch with you, or how can they learn more about what you write, etc.?
Yeah, you can search for the book and or go to my name, Jacob, Jacob, and then my last name, Mchangama, Mchangama.com. So that's a website, and there you can find how to buy the book, all the pieces, podcast interviews, and everything related to it. And you can also find my contact details and how to follow me on Twitter and all these things.
So are you on Amazon? The book's on Amazon? And
the book is on Amazon, currently #1 in legal history. Might not be J.K. Rowling figures, but
you'll get there. Yeah. Well, Jacob, thanks for great insight, and I think your approach is very I don't know if the word is centric, but it just pulling us back to free speech and exercising free speech and protecting it, I think, is very important for this country and around the world. And we as you said, we thrive on our differences. We make progress, albeit slowly sometimes, but progress is made. We don't want to unwind it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.